Hey, Mel, Bri here. Gotta work from home today because the whole family caught a nasty...
Daddy!
Hey, Mikey, if you're gonna puke, find the popcorn bowl! But my availability is 110%. Coincidentally, so is my fever. Kidding. Mel, I'm so cold but hot. But I'm gonna get you that budget just as soon as... Mikey, popcorn bowl!
Press 1 to use Instacart and get your family's sick day essentials delivered in as fast as 30 minutes. Press 2 to keep working. Do not press 2. Just use Instacart, Brian.
Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. Oh, fuck. I messed it up. Just kind of petered out there. Welcome to a Historia Canadiana, the show where Canlit boys talk about their Canlit toys. My name is Patrick, and with me is my co-host Mackenzie.
I want to know, what is your Canlit toy?
It's my microphone.
Oh,
Don't ask questions.
okay. You're not going to make a fun joke with that? That's fine.
Eventually, we'll be able to talk about real Canlit toys when we get to talking about the most erotic book in Canlit called Bear, which
Don't
is
you mean
great.
Barometer Rising?
Oh yeah, obviously. I think a woman having a sexual relationship with a bear is quite better in this game.
I'm sorry, the only bear story I care about is Big Bear.
Thank you. Excellent segue. Before we get into the actual show, we like to shout out our patrons, including the new ones. So thank you, Keen, Alex, Jessica, Elise, Tommy, James, Belinda, Noah, and Paula for supporting the show. You can do so for $1 a month or $3 a month and get access to extra content. So consider
Woo!
that. Hell
Extra
yeah.
content.
We actually just recorded an episode on Letterkenny last week. So
yeah,
that was
talk
fun.
about Letterkenny.
Yep. That's actually something I'm considering of watching more of now that I know it's on Crave. So that's great.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So as the title of the show indicates, we're going to be talking about Big Bear in this case, and we're going to be doing so through the novelized adaptation of his life by Rudy Wiebe, which came out in 1973. Now, have you heard of either Big Bear, Rudy Wiebe, or the novel at any point in the past?
Rudy Wiebe sounds vaguely familiar.
I think we talked about him once.
Yeah.
One time
I feel like
at
he
the
was on a
cottage.
couple of my syllabuses.
It's very possible. Yeah, he wrote a lot of short stories and novels that have been kind of canonized in the Canlit sphere. Yeah. But yeah,
Whether or not I read those short stories is up for who knows, because I don't remember, but
most likely not, and you just kind of winged it, as you tend to do.
As I tend to, and things turn out fine. Thank you very much.
I mean, there you go, got a degree.
I was
so there
an
you
honors student. Thank you very much.
Really, really a shining light of our domain of literature when you can just wing it and be an honors student.
I mean, I think it's a good representation on the fact that we're learning skills in literature, not just information.
100%. Did I ever tell
he
you?
He continues to wing it to this day and nails it every fucking time. Let's go, baby.
Did I ever tell you about this? And then we'll get into the episode. That one of my profs, like at some point, made a kind of joke about the fact that I hadn't read the text for a class on 18th century lit that I was taking. And she kind of made like a fake fuss about it, like, oh my God, how could you not read this text that people get so much out of? And it was like a Daniel Defoe text. It was like the Journal of the Plague Year. And I was like, yeah, I don't know. I just kind of decided to wing it. I kind of got the gist of it after the first chapter. And she got kind of incensed and then sent me an email after class saying like, hey, I didn't want to put you on the spot there, but I kind of admire the skills that it took to just kind of wing that class and having only read 2 chapters. And I was like, thank you.
Yeah, like, and that was me almost every class. Teachers give you fucking novels and they're like, read this in a week. And I'm like, you just told me to read it. Therefore, this is the last thing I want to read now.
Story of my life. It's just like, ask anyone to do anything and it's not going to happen.
Well, especially since like they don't give proper reasoning when they tell you to read it. They're just like, oh, we're going to read this and discuss this. Like, I can speak to this because I am in fact a fucking teacher. That is not how you teach books in English.
Yeah. like actually give a valid and interesting reason to study a text, and people will engage with it. But
Right.
yeah, just doing it for the sake of doing it, no. I feel like that's what's true with everything, though. Anyway, we could go down a rabbit hole, but like, yeah.
Yeah, let's get back to Big Bear.
So I figured, as usual, we could just do the history first. I kind of separated up the notes in three parts. Talk a little bit about Rudy Wiebe.
Yeah.
In the second part, first part about Big Bear, and then kind of talk about the novelized elements, or at least the ones that I think are most interesting to talk about in the context of literature.
Is Big Bear similar
Um,
to Brother Bear, the hit Disney film?
yes, obviously. Yeah. It's,
Yay.
in fact, it's not about an indigenous leader. It's about a Inuit person who transforms into a bear, actually. So yeah, there you go.
There you go.
Is that what Big Brother Bear is about? I don't remember.
No, Brother Bear? No, not at all. No. It's a Disney film. It's like a found family story about a guy who gets turned into a bear.
Close enough.
It's a bad representation. Oh no, I don't know if it's a bad representation of First Nation culture actually, because it is a post-Pocahontas movie.
So it would be okay. I don't know. I really don't know. I've never.
It was never. It
I
was a very
remember.
mid movie though. I remember watching it and just being like, "Yeah, this is pretty mid."
That's fair. So Big Bear, right? Um, as far as talking about his history goes, and we'll see this with the novel as well,
Mhm.
there's kind of like this period that everyone talks about because that's where a lot happened, both in terms of the grand scheme of Canadian history, in which he was sometimes tangentially related, and that's why people talk about it, but also just because we simply don't know much about his early life. So, really, whenever we hear about discussions of Big Bear, both in the novel and just as far as history is concerned, it's really like this 15 to 20-year period that people talk about, and then nothing else, right? But Big Bear lived for quite some time. And unfortunately, we just kind of have to start with what we know, which is not his early life, but really when he became a chief, after having been part of kind of Cree and Ojibwe family, a mix in this case, mixed heritage. And he would become chief of a small group of Cree people in the 1870s or in the early.
Mhm.
And he would, after becoming chief, he would have a sacred vision in this case, in which he saw the bear spirit, which is apparently the most sacred spirit for the Cree people. And
Ugh.
it's at that point that he received his name, which in Cree would be Mistahi Maskwa. I hope I'm not butchering that. But
Yeah,
translates
fucking
to
no.
Big Bear.
We should
I
probably
will
have checked that
probably.
out beforehand.
I read it and I still butchered. I still failed, but it's fine.
Oh,
For the
you
sake
fail
of not
because you
butchering it,
do not,
right?
as
For the sake
Yoda
of
would
not
say.
butchering it, sorry. Go ahead, say what you wanted to say.
As Yoda would say, you fail because you are not doing.
Wise words from a puppet.
Do or do not. There is no try.
But as all good literature students, I fail upwards. So, moving on in this case, I'll probably just
Officially, shout out to our boy Patrick for being a PhD candidate now. Bringing
thank
some
you.
actual street cred to this channel.
Like actually trying hard at a career. I don't know. We'll see what that gives.
Who'd have thought?
Certainly not my parents, but hey, that's a discussion for another time. Yeah, just to, by the way, for the sake of clarity, I might refer to the topic of our show today as Mistahe Masqua, but probably I'll just use Big Bear, even though it's a translation, just because to avoid, sounding like I have a foot in my mouth accidentally. So what's another important thing to kind of set the groundwork for, because this does come up in the novel as well, is that in part because of his name and also because of the culture in which he comes from, Big Bear would have with him what is referred to, depending on the translation, as either a sacred bundle or a power bundle or a secret bundle. And it's basically this small package that is basically said to contain protection for the person who wears them. We see this in all kinds of cultures. And in this case, it was apparently a bear paw, which was worn around his neck, especially during times of danger. mostly for the protection that we're talking about, but also in order to provide him with courage and strength.
Mhm.
So this is kind of the earliest setup that we have as far as his early life is concerned. And really, where a lot of people's interest in Big Bear starts is with the treaties, in this case. Those wonderful, pesky things. As far as Big Bear is concerned, so he's living out in Western Canada, what for Canadians at the time would have been known as the Northwest Territories, what we now know is basically the Prairie Provinces now. And Treaty 6 was supposed to encompass pretty much Saskatchewan in this case, or at least a major part of, which indicative, by the way, of the post-Confederation treaties, you see them just get larger and larger and larger. It's just these mass negotiations that happen, which is
God.
terrifying. Have you ever actually seen maps of the various treaties of Canada?
No.
It's insane. Like, you can look it up, like treaty maps in Canada, and you literally see
Yeah.
as the numbers go up, so to do the area or the surface area that's covered by them. So it's just madness to watch. Here, hold on. This is going to play great on an audio segment. But if you look at like Treaty 11, it basically covers most of the Northwest Territories, what we now consider the Northwest
Yes.
Territories. Treaty 8 is most of the northern Alberta and northern BC. So it's just like these massive territories of land. But if you compare it to like Treaty 2, it's part of southern Manitoba. It's just like a really small section. So really by the end, they were just taking out big chunks of land. And that's depressing.
Yeah, well,
Sorry,
there's
go
an
ahead.
interesting fact I learned that Canada has a lot more reservations than the US does, but they're much smaller.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so like the US has, I can't remember the exact numbers, has fewer reserves, but their reserves are like take for example the Navajo territory. It's huge. It is one of the biggest ever, and Canada has nothing that compares in size. But Canada has a lot more of them, so it makes sense in it makes sense in the context of like they were just stealing big swaths of land and then giving out a bunch of small reserves, with these treaties.
Interesting. Oh yeah, look at that. I just looked up the Navajo reservation as you're talking about. It basically covers the corners of Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico. Wow. Okay, I never realized it was that big. Oh, that's cool. I mean, cool. It sucks that they're on a reservation, but yeah, I get what you mean.
Yeah.
So our story, as far as this is concerned, is particularly focused on Treaty Number 6 in this case, which again you can kind of look up a map for. But yeah, big part of Saskatchewan and Alberta in this case. And a character who does appear in the novel would be the one who at least kicks it off and tried to negotiate it. And this is the Lieutenant Governor of Manitoba and the Northwest Territories, a man by the name of Alexander Morris, who has a great dialogue with Big Bear at some point in the novel, and we'll talk about it. And he basically went to Fort Carleton in order to negotiate with the Indigenous peoples of Saskatchewan. And at this point, Big Bear would have already been chief. And we find out that he didn't actually know that other members, either of his band or other leaders, had signed that treaty. And afterwards, when Morris would come to Big Bear with this proposition, he would be one of the few to refuse. And in part, it was because he thought that the terms that were offered to him were very poor, and also because of a perceived loss of freedom that this was going to give the Indigenous populations that he represented. Fair enough. Yeah, already. So 1876. This is 9 years. Yeah, 9 years after Confederation in this case. Treaties have already started decades ago. So it is interesting that this is already yes, news traveled slower at the time, of course, but there would have already been a recognition by a lot of Indigenous people that treaties, even relatively early on in their history, as far as this is concerned, are not necessarily on equal footing anymore, right? It's not what people were expecting. And it's interesting because I really like this that I found. So apparently Big Bear compared Treaty 6 in particular to a rope around his people's neck. And
Yo, he's not wrong.
no, right. And which
The man is
obviously is
spinning straight facts.
like, yes, as far as like killing people is concerned as well, but you can also think about strangling freedom and restricting people as far as like actually tying them and limiting control over resources and a way of life and so on. So there's, yes, the very intense, like death related strangling and rope around our neck, but also just in the metaphorical. Ultimately, just this act of refusal and wanting to actually negotiate proper conditions for his people would label Big Bear as a kind of troublemaker from the government's perspective in this case, because how dare he want like equal footing between nations? What a rebel rouser in this case, rabble rouser, I should say. But yeah,
What a rabble rouser.
like, who'd have thought? But what's interesting is that this act of defiance, right, without taking up arms necessarily, would draw more and more independent warriors to his camp, right? And people who see this as a moment in which to band together against the encroachment of Canadian officials and settler colonialism. And eventually, a few years later, in 1878, which this would be in Alberta, he and others would meet with the new lieutenant governor of the Northwest Territories, a man by the name of David Laird. And once again, they would not come to a conclusion in this case. And this would actually stand out for quite some time, for many years, until 1882, when at this point, starvation and a lack of buffalo, which was the main source of food for a lot of people on, and just indigenous people on the plains in general, was low to such a point that they just could not survive without the help of outside forces such as the Canadian government. So, classic technique right there. 10 out of 10 Canadian governments starve them out. Wonderful.
Good job, Canadian
wonderful
government.
Stuff.
You did great.
Oh yeah, just knocking it out of the park every single episode. Anyway, so ultimately by 1884, so about 10 years after, a little bit over 10 years after he would become chief, he and his band, which numbered about 500 at this point, would move towards Battleford. And they would join up with about 2,000 other Indigenous people from various Saskatchewan reserves, including the famous Poundmaker, who's another Indigenous leader that was active at this time. I'm not going to try to pronounce his name because it's very long, and yeah, I'm just not going to even.
It would be kind of insulting for us to try and pronounce it, butcher it.
Yeah, at this point, yeah, I'm just, at least Big Bears, I can recognize the letters. Some of them in this one, I'm like, no.
Well, it's also Big Bear is a translation. And so
yeah, exactly.
I have to assume that Poundmaker is the translation of this original name.
Exactly.
So it's probably better that we use those names that the English gave them instead of trying to assume that we can speak their names, which would probably have important cultural significance.
Exactly. So doing the best we can. So the whole point of this actual reunion, or at least gathering in 1884, was in order to perform what is called a thirst dance. Have you ever heard of the thirst dance in this case?
No, but now you have my attention.
Yeah, it's not as like, unfortunately, not in the same contemporary connotations of being thirsty, but
gosh darn.
But the
thirsty for
you
some
might have heard
social justice.
Exactly. But actually, you might have heard it under different names. The most common one is Sundance, and it's also called the Rain Dance, which is odd considering that these are contradictory at times, right? Sun, rain, or thirst might not be necessarily pertinent to different ideas. And honestly, that's kind of the point, because you use different names depending on what you want the ceremony to do. But ultimately it all relates to different aspects that you want to encourage, right? Good health, like a growing season, for example, might be more related to rain or sun, whereas wanting to encourage good health or a safe community might be related to something else. So in essence, right, these dances are all related in some sense to the wider concept of a renewal of life.
Mhm.
Which metaphorically speaking and tangibly speaking is obviously pertinent for a lot of Indigenous people at this time facing the Canadian
Right.
government, reservation. Not a surprise. I don't know, did you have anything to add to anything I've said so far?
About the injustice of reserves, or about the
Anything at all.
I think it is interesting to note how, like, what the different mindsets of, because we've talked about the First Nation response to treaties and such before, and for many the response was like depression, like really fucking depression of like, this is where we're stuck, this is what we're going to be ending up with. There's anger, there's a very strong tint of anger of like, oh, we will fight back with this. There's ones even who bargained, who are very much trying to be like, oh, we're gonna find a way to work with this. Big Bear is probably the first that is just like acceptance, like without
Honestly,
accepting.
no. Yeah, exactly. Like kind of passively resist, like, yeah, passive resistance, I guess.
Well,
Or
because if we might as well get into it, like he himself, like he didn't lead resistance movement. He just kept sort of not taking the deal.
yeah, it's what's the term? Non-cooperation, I
Yeah,
guess. Yeah,
but I
that's
mean in
interesting.
reaction to like because like, yeah, he didn't accept the deal, but he was the only one that was like, this is what this deal is going to look like. This is going
Mm,
to be bad, and this is like, there's no denial, there's no rage, there's no like, there's maybe some sadness and depression, but there's mostly just this like, hey, this is what
yeah.
it's going to be like, man.
There's there's also it's interesting that right around the same time is when Louis Riel is kind of taking up arms,
Mm.
right? In 1885 would be the
Or other
big
people are
Northwest
taking up
resistance.
arms in name of Louis Riel.
Oh yeah, for sure. Absolutely. As we've talked about in an episode like many months back at but yeah, so it's interesting, you're right, to see these kind of different perspectives forming around what is ultimately a very similar and how that plays out. Yeah. So on the surface of it, this thirst dance, right, looks pretty all right. There's people gathering. It's actually the largest united effort made by the Plains Cree at that point against the Canadian
Mm-hmm.
government, and no one's really taking up arms in this case. It's really just a traditional dance. So,
Mm-hmm.
what's the logical thing to do in this case? Well, according to the farming instructor, the settler farming instructor on that reservation, John Craig is his name, you call the cops. And that's exactly what he did because,
Are you a
there's
fucking
nothing more
cop?
terrible.
You know you have to tell me.
You wonder why people are skeptical of government institute and power. It's
Yeah.
like they were having a traditional gathering, and that's terrifying enough to be like, no, let's call in the guns.
They're standing there menacingly.
Like, I know you're saying that as a joke, but at the
But
same
no,
time,
I
like,
know, like the truth is funnier than fiction.
right. It's just like they're standing there menacingly. What the fuck is your problem, John? What are you doing?
To pull to
Oh,
a conversation me and Patrick were talking about earlier. So I saw this group of First Nations standing in my yard, and I thought they were doing something. So I called the cops on them without any evidence. Am I the asshole? Yes.
moral of yes. I think the moral of like most of our recent episodes has been, is Canada the asshole? Yes.
Yes. I mean, yeah, no, like it's such a fucking mess of how, and it's so systemic. You can't
Mhm.
even exactly blame the farmer, because you know his reaction is based on what he's been told. And like, he's probably been told, oh, if you see groups of First Nations gathering together, report it.
Yeah.
Like,
And this is
you
something,
can't get, I can't even be angry at the farmer, you know?
that's the thing. Like, yes, there is on one level, he's just like doing his job, but I think you can also be frustrated. Like, no one would have, no one would have stopped you from just shutting up, right? So at some point you
Yeah.
are complicit in it as well. Right?
Oh no, I mean, I
Um,
like obviously I know he's part of the problem, but it's like my anger at him specifically as an individual is like
yeah,
very non-existent in comparison to
yeah.
like he's just another asshole who is like indoctrinated and brainwashed.
It is kind of interesting as
This
well.
is why we should tear down the government and we should institute a total lack of government to go back to like a grassroots libertarian movement.
Obviously, yep, that's the only way
That's
to
the
solve
solution.
every problem. It is
Just let
interesting
big
as
big
well.
business take over. They have our best
Oh,
interests at heart.
always. There's never been any indication to the contrary. Anyway, sit on that one for a while. The I do find it interesting though that John, the cop collar in this case, the
Fucking
bootlicker,
narc.
as we'll call him, the narc.
The snitch. The snitch is gonna get stitches.
I do find it very interesting that, like you said, not only is he a farmer, but he's the farming instructor, right? So his role in this case, a big part of reservations, was to teach indigenous people Western farming practices. Right, that was a major part of what was offered by the Canadian government, because of course indigenous people weren't allowed to maintain every single aspect of their traditional culture on reservations, in which they were supposed to be allowed to maintain their traditional
Hey,
culture.
you know this really successful farming technique that you have that like doesn't kill the ground and the soil underneath it and it does good crop rotations? Yeah. You can't do that anymore.
You're wrong.
You're wrong. It's been working for you for like hundreds and thousands of years at this point, but no more, I say.
Well, and that's it's kind of ironic because, well, it's not ironic, it's how imperialism works in this case. But you know, one of the things that encouraged this thirst dance was the fact that people were starving on the reservations, right? Not just because of the lack of bison and buffalo, but because of the failure of crops, which happens when you're exactly what you're talking about, when you just do monoculture. That's just a
Yeah.
part of thing. That's how starvation
That's just
happened
bad farming.
everywhere across the world. Yeah, that's just bad farming. And
This
so
isn't
it's
something that's been fixed either. People understand that monoculture is a very real problem in today's society.
100%. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so, but yeah, it is interesting that this guy who has a vested interest in, like, yes, in part that's part of his job to maintain order on the reservation, but also he has a vested interest in this type of practice because his job literally depends on it. And so any kind of like threat to that is problematic for him. And also a lot of these dances were actually made illegal by the Canadian.
They're
Which great.
dancing
You can't have
menacingly.
I hate to make a comparison with Footloose because it's not at all the same thing, but that's all I can think of in this very specific moment, and I hate it.
I was literally just thinking about like these people are basically the first rock and roll legends. Elvis Presley, eat your fucking heart out.
Fuck you. Okay.
Say fuck you.
Yeah. Okay. Your mother already told us that these episodes are too long, so let's move on in this case. So ultimately, the Big Bears, right, is not someone, as you mentioned, who wanted to necessarily take up arms against Canada. He was much more interested in basically non-cooperation, passive resistance kind of thing.
Just
In
don't
part
sign the
because
treaty, man.
just
They
don't
can't
do it.
make you do it.
Don't engage.
Like, literally, that was his solution.
Yeah, don't talk to the cops was his solution, I guess. But hey, cool.
They can't force you to talk. God.
I think part of it as well, or we know also that part of it was because he knew that his people were at a point where they just couldn't win against the Canadian government at this. Yes, okay, Indigenous people had guns by then, but in terms of like pure numbers and ability to fight in an organized way, like,
And also
you
just
just
like
can't go up.
First Nations relied on honor and fighting like as a unit as well as like fighting honorably. White people don't do that.
You mean the military doesn't do that?
No. No, and again, like I'm not automatically say like it's a horrible thing that we should fight with more honor, blah blah blah. But it's like it's a difference it's one of those differences in culture. We value being clever and ending the fight before it happens. Like there's
And
not before it happens, but there's a lot of value in like beating them without putting our own at risk, which is why we develop different types of technology and why we have drones and missiles for the drones and everything else now.
we want to distance ourselves.
Yeah. We don't want to feel emotion
Um,
when we kill our opponent.
no, we want it to feel like a video game, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Fucking gamers.
so there's actually a really interesting line by Big Bear where he says, the country, Canada in this case, would no doubt get rid of the Indians and all troublesome questions in connection with them in a comparatively short time if we were to go to war with them, which is a bit cynical, is like a very dark way to think about it, but I can kind of see where he's coming from. Unfortunately,
100%.
yeah, unfortunately, it wasn't a very
like,
popular opinion. Go ahead.
It's but it's also like and this is not an, it might be taken as an insult, but Big Bear demonstrates the best understanding of the thinking and thoughts of white people of any First Nations chief I think we've seen. Like he gets it. He knows exactly what we're on, what kind of like drugs we're on, what kind of like what white man burden bullshit we're riding.
At the same time, he thinks that we like then that's one of the things that would turn people or his own people against him in the end is like he also thinks that he has the ability to beat them at their own game in this case, right? He thinks that he can win on this thing that's already stacked against him, right? The treaty negotiations, going up against the government and so on. Like even someone like Riel, who did take up arms, would eventually be beat by the system in the way that it was kind of set up and stacked against him in his own trial. So like it's a very cynical way of looking at it, and that's not me saying that you shouldn't resist or rebel against injustice in such a way, but it does show just how powerful a lot of things can be when no matter how you go about them, it does end up you do end up getting fucked over in like big bad ways.
There was no winning. Nobody was ever going to win.
Like maybe at the start, but especially by then when like a lot of them are not necessarily united, right? Now, as you were saying, bringing 2,000 indigenous people together in 1884 was like that year's or like that decade's big coalition, so to speak, right? Which ultimately against like a burgeoning imperialist country is peanuts. Do you need a much more united movement than that in order to, to do anything?
Yeah, no, there was never gonna be a win.
Yeah.
I don't know, there's just at no point in the history of colonialism was there ever going to be a win for First Nations people, I think.
No,
even
not
if
on
they
their
had a full
terms.
Yeah. And it's such a depressingly sad thing to realize.
Exactly. And yeah, like to bring it back to what I was saying before of like this would eventually lead people against him, right? This kind of trying to beat people at their own game or thinking that there was like an equal footing and an honor, would eventually turn especially the warriors within his nation against Big Bear, right? So that throughout 1884 and 1885, this band kind of dissolved itself, right? Or at least the major people who were fighting for indigenous rights and change kind of went away from Big Bear's center of attention in this case, which is at which point, right, Big Bear and the rest of his group would settle near Frog Lake, which in 1885 was where a major event happened, which is part of the Northwest Rebellion. So again, he's just kind of like tangentially there in this case.
He's just there, man.
He just happened to be there, quite literally, because he did not take up arms. And other, like his people who were related to him, like his son and a war chief called Wandering Spirit, who was a part of his group, did participate in the Frog Lake conflict, right? In which 9 inhabitants would be killed in this case of the region. And basically within Big Bear's nation or Big Bear's group, there was kind of like a mini coup in which that war chief of Wandering Spirit would take control of the band and would participate much more actively in what was happening within the context of the Northwest Rebellion in this case. But again, this was not necessarily Big Bear's volition. He was there tangentially. Nevertheless, he would be arrested with everyone else, right? Or at least a lot of the other people. And he would be convicted of treason and sentenced to 3 years in prison.
Fun.
For doing nothing, for standing there
For-
menacingly, as you're saying.
He's just standing there menacingly.
I hate laughing at this because it's a meme at this point, but yeah, it's ridiculous, obviously.
That was literally
And-
every reaction to the First Nations people is just, they're standing there menacingly.
I know, but what's interesting is that, again, we see this quite often, especially in the 1800s, although you see that today as well, but when like fact checking was not as prevalent in the 1800s,
When
and
has
yellow
fact checking
journalism
ever
was
been
just a thing.
prevalent?
But that's at least it was easier to get away with it at the time. Today,
Even
people
the
fact check,
Enlightenment,
but
for all its talking, does not fact check.
no. But anyway, at the time, people cared even less. Let's just say, and he was basically Big Bear was basically smeared in a publicity campaign by the news in this case that took up what happened in Frog Lake and its environs, and would label him as a bloodthirsty killer, even though he was no longer even the band leader. In 1888, he would eventually be released from prison. From what I've seen in my in researching this topic, it didn't necessarily there wasn't necessarily much eventful going on. He was still able to like send letters or anything like that. He was just there. And he would die a year later on the Little Pine Reserve in this case. Before getting into the novel itself, is there anything that you wanted to mention in particular, either about kind of events surrounding his life or the man himself, right, that you thought might be interesting to at least touch upon, or that you wanted to, take up before we got into a more thorough discussion in this case?
I think that's about it.
So, novel in this case that we're talking about, Rudy Wiebe's The Temptation of Big Bear, came out in 1973. Wiebe himself is not an indigenous person, although he is known for treating indigenous issues in his novels and his short stories in a way that's head and above a lot of settler writers in Canada. He's known for actually going out and talking to indigenous groups on the prairies and elsewhere, and actually being someone who cares and takes their concerns seriously and approaches them in a respectful.
Cares.
Yeah, like he does the effort, pretty much, right? Wiebe himself is a Mennonite. The only reason that this matters is because he also writes about this particular community, right? And so religion is a major component of both his writing style, and his belief system, right? The way that the outlook that he has on his world, and to a lot of critics, that has kind of informed his more sensitive and very complex approach to minorities in Canada. Because Mennonites are minorities, and for a lot of critics and to himself, that's kind of a way into addressing another minority, in this case, indigenous. Yeah, you might have known him as well. He wrote a book called The Blue Mountains of China, which was very well received. He wrote many short stories, including Where is the Voice Coming From, which is excellent. And he also wrote a novel on Louis Riel as well, called The Scorched Wood People, or at least the Métis, which is, kind of good. We might come back to him, actually, because he wrote another historical novel about a guy called the Mad Trapper, which you might have heard of as someone who has spent time in the he was kind of a well-known figure in the north of like this trapper who kind of went to have a shootout with local police and kind of became a local legend. Anyway, he wrote a novel about him, and we might talk about him because he's a fun character.
Nice.
Yeah. And Wiebe is still alive, by the way. He's like almost 90 at this point, but
What's his name? Sorry.
Rudy Wiebe in this case. Oh, sorry,
Oh,
the
Weeb.
the
Okay.
character. Yeah, you mean the character or of like the kind of insane person?
Both.
Okay. Yeah, anyway,
Anyway,
the
back to
novel
it. The
in this
novel.
case. So you read part of it. I know you didn't have time to read all of it because you have a full-time job like an adult. Ugh.
Yo, adulting for the win. I have to buy cleaning supplies.
Um, but yeah, based on what you've read so far, and like I know you read parts of it, is there anything in particular that you kind of want to start off with? Just your general thoughts on the novel based on what I've told you as the history? Anything that you want to start us off with, where that's.
Mm-hmm. Oh, but where do I want to start with the novel?
Mhm.
Let's start with the language
Okay. What do
because
you
I think
what
it's
do you got?
actually it's. I think it's interesting because this is when was this novel written again?
1973. It was published in 73. I don't know if it
Okay.
was written.
There's a very and it's a false, relaxed tone to it, if that makes sense.
Okay. Do you want to elaborate more about what you mean
Like
by that?
in its language and etc. Like we see very like it's not very formal. It's not very like trying to be ominous. It's just it lulls you into a very false sense of security in its writing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like even like so if you start with the first page, the Honorable Sweetgrass outside the Trinity, the Honorable Alex Morris, PC Lieutenant Governor of Manitoba, the Northwest Territories, and Kiwatin looked down his long, wide nose again, past his mustache, and the clerk surged soldier at the heavy X on the paper. Like there's a very sort of like not comical, but more like
Colloquial.
he's looking down his wide nose. Like there's like a caricature.
Yeah. In this case, I not long after that, in the start of the third paragraph, I also like the way that that paragraph starts. Once he would have thought those 27 his X marks under Sweetgrass and James Seenham made little difference, but no longer.
Mhm.
Not after the several hundred thousand square miles to which he had finally and forever extinguished, as the Prime Minister likes to say, all native rights. Like
Right.
there's this darkness, there's this dark undertone to what's being addressed, obviously, like the extinguishment of native rights in this case. But the way he's talking about it is just so casual and it's just so flippant in a sense.
It's
And
just a
obviously
thing,
in
you
this
know.
case,
We're just chilling.
yeah, it's this opening uh section is told from the perspective of Alexander Morris, who we talked about briefly,
Mhm.
and not from Big Bear. And yeah, that's one thing I think that Weeb does really interestingly is balancing those different types of voices, because at other points it is from Big Bear's perspective. And
Right.
sometimes it's like this weird omniscient narrator that's neither. It's just kind of like the spirit that's inhabiting the story, so to speak. And all of these different voices kind of interplay in really interesting ways in the novel. And every single time the writing style changes in this case. As I wrote in the notes, and this I got from another CanLit expert in this case, who gave a lecture on Rudy Wiebe, a man called Derry
Cool.
Goldie, a very interesting thinker. If
Mm-hmm.
people are interested again in settler approaches to indigenous concerns, Terry Goldie's a really good example. But I remember Goldie described the way that this novel operates as kind of balancing the micro and the macro perspectives through language in a really interesting way. And I think both the passage that you pointed out and the passage that I read after kind of point to that. At the same time, we're looking deeply into Morris's perspective in this case as someone who thinks he's doing something important for himself and his career and describing his grandioseness. But at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, we're getting so much information on what's going on a much wider scope of Canadian politics and society at this time in the 19th century. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
There was another passage, this one is on page 49, where we get another impression of this. I'm just gonna go down to the page. Yeah, okay. Sweetgrass had loved my father. My father often said that Indians baptized as papists usually showed only the best and rarely any of the worst qualities of that sad heresy. So it was with Sweetgrass, or Abraham, if you will, who smiled and said, 2 summers ago, this young man came to tell us of the coming police. Everything he told us was true. Last summer, his father told us of the one who speaks for the Queen Mother, who would come to deal with us justly, that no more poles would be put in the ground or land measured before he came to deal with us. And now the governor is here. Yesterday we heard what he had to say. This young man's father is no longer here to counsel us, but him I know as one white man who has an Indian heart. Peter Erasmus has told us what happened at Carleton. I want John to tell us in his words what has been said here so he can fully understand. Yeah, especially that beginning part, right? Sweetgrass had loved my father. My father had often said that Indians baptized as papists usually showed only the best and rarely any of the worst quality.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like this internal monologue that also shows a lot about a widespread misconceptions about Indigenous people. Just like, oh, they're being baptized, but they don't really buy into it, and this kind of thing. They still have this like bit of this internal quote unquote savagery to them, right? That just doesn't quite fit in with Christianity or with mainstream, so to speak, Canadian society.
Don't fit in with the mainstream.
I know. But yeah,
Mainstream Christianity.
but it also gives like this
They're
sense...
not helping to get more zip lines for the church.
But
I'm sorry.
I feel like no, it's fine. I think it gives like this sense of accuracy, right, to the book, right? Because it is fiction, so to speak, even if it is very much indebted to the historical moment. But ultimately, the characters and people are saying things that they never would have said, right? They're given voices that they wouldn't have had. But it still gives this impression of authenticity, right? To ground it in this kind of language that you bring up. Yeah. And I'm wondering, I don't know, do you have anything to say about that particular idea, right? Like why, like how that authenticity kind of shines.
How the authenticity shines through the language? Or
yeah, or just in general.
I love that you always tack that on the end, or just in general. What are your thoughts?
No, giving you an out. I can take it into any direction you want.
No, but I think that's true. Like the language does sort of, it makes it accessible as well. This is a story, like gives the idea that this is a story that anybody can and should read to learn a bit more about history, and I think that was a smart move.
Absolutely. By the way, we should have maybe started by saying like how the novel, like what the novel actually addresses, but pretty much I think we talked about it at the beginning of the podcast. Pretty much the novel covers what we talked about historically speaking as far as like time is concerned.
Yeah.
Didn't mention that, but yeah, it pretty much covers the like period of 12 years between Big Bear's refusal to sign the treaty up to his death. Like that's pretty much what we're doing. And yeah, kind of expanding on that, it is kind of, I like that idea of accessibility in this case that you brought up. It's fascinating to me how that happened, because you wouldn't expect no, but especially because when you think of like these highly complex polyvocal, right, text, right, I don't know, to come back to the classic example that I always use, right, when you listen to like James Joyce, for example, or when you listen like when you think of like these really complex novels, you wouldn't necessarily expect them to be so accessible in this sense, right? And I really agree with you in that sense that the way that language is utilized, or like bringing it down almost to an anachronistic type of language that wouldn't necessarily have been used in the 19th century, but that was certainly used by the time that Wiebe was writing in the 1970s, is a good way to bring that into a more accessible realm, but without losing any of that historical sense, or that complexity as far as history is. Yeah, I don't know if you had anything to add on that, but yeah, I just thought that was a good point on your end of like, it's surprisingly approachable.
Yeah, no, I think that was important because so many similar texts sort of treat these issues as something so much more far removed, or something that's it plants itself very much within history. This is a past issue, and I think giving more accessible, approachable language very much brings it like this is a present issue this is a thing that is still just needing to be talked about.
Absolutely. And I think the text does kind of address that this is a present issue.
Mm-hmm.
Hold on, I had a page here. This was on 169. Okay, yeah, at the kind of bottom of 169 in this case, just before there's a really good passage that does indicate the relation to the present while still rooting it in this historical past, what would have been at the time over almost 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to read this passage here. There have been no drums for a long time. If my shack had a larger window, I think I could see light coming over the Eagle Hills. Friday, June 20th, 1884. Pray God no Canadian schoolboy ever has to memorize that date. Our bruised Craig snores. This game is not worth my candle, nor anyone. So there's this is actually just after so 1884, this is as conflicts are starting to emerge, right? And
Mm-hmm.
this is specifically at this point in the novel, this is specifically after the thirst dance in this.
The
And
menacing dancing.
yeah, right. And I really like that line. Pray God no Canadian schoolboy ever has to memorize that, which is kind of an ironic passage in this sense, because on the one hand, Canadian schoolboys, I think, should learn this date, right? As far as history is concerned, it should be a part of um, of the curriculum, of the knowledge of how kind of resistance was meted out by Indigenous people towards the Canadian government. But at the
Mm-hmm.
same time, the text, which is very much infused with a lot of this um, imperialist ideology, right? I think deliberately so in this case on Wiebe's end, saying like, no, writing can be this vehicle for perpetuating certain forms of ideology, saying that, no, okay, people who are telling the story, especially through a very Eurocentric medium that is the novel, wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily frame it in this way, right? And wouldn't necessarily frame it in a way that makes it a good thing, right? And so just through these simple passages kind of indicates how we kind of diminish these moments in history. Again, through very subtle language in this case. Out of a 300-page book, there's like these one or two or three sentences here and there that just bring us back to the fact that, hey, there's maybe a reason why you're not learning about this in school and why you should maybe pay attention.
Why maybe you should demand differently. Ask for more.
Yeah, like go to your local library, why don't you?
Go to your local library.
No, but do you see what I mean? Like, I don't know if you have
Mm,
anything that you want to like say about that, more like this sense of the historical present, so to speak. But yeah, I just thought that that's kind of like an interesting passage where that shines along with like the anachronistic language that we are talking
right.
about. Yeah. I want to talk a little bit, kind of elaborating um, on the way that language is used, and then we promise listeners that we'll come back to like other things than the language. But I think this novel just provides
I
so many opportunities to talk about that particular aspect that it's inevitable. Did you read the section on page 28, 29, where there's a dialogue between Big Bear and the
oh, I
surveyor?
think yes, I think I glanced at it.
Okay. It's a really
But
great
yeah,
passage. So,
yeah,
uh,
the
so
sovereign queen discussion.
yeah,
God,
exactly. Okay. Do you want to play Governor Morris and I'll play Big Bear, or vice versa in this case?
I'll be Governor Morris, sure.
So to put people in context in this case, Governor Morris is arriving to negotiations with Big Bear. In this case, this is when the treaty is
Mhm.
first starting to be negotiated. I guess you can start at the bottom of 28.
The I'm the representative of the Queen, as my blue coat shows, and as Mr. McKay and Mr. Christie have told everyone here, I am head counselor in this territory, as they are also counselors. When you hear my voice, you are listening to your great mother, the Queen. She tells you, I love my red children, as well as my white. I know it is hard for them to live, and I have always helped those that live in need in other parts of my dominion. We have agreed about what the Queen is willing to do for you, so that you never need go hungry, as Sweetgrass has said.
Bear seemed to be pondering Sweetgrass as if the interpreter was simply a medium, a bird flying by, perhaps. Counselor?
Yes, I am her head counselor.
The queen speaks to us?
Yes, you have heard her voice, whom God bless and preserve long to reign over us.
There was momentary silence. The White Queen is a woman? Tell that.
I think
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, there's a nice big thing underneath, a nice big paragraph that basically just says that all the dudes got insulted for calling the queen a woman.
But why would that be insulting in this case? Right? Like, what's the joke here?
Yeah. Oh, fuck if I know or if I care. It's just funny, man.
Right.
Like this shit just funny.
But part of it is because, right, the whole thing is that for a lot of the way that settler interactions happened with indigenous people was based around masculinity in this case. And
Yeah.
I think the joke that Big Bear is pointing to in this case is that, not necessarily that it's a problem that a woman is in charge, but that this person, this settler who's supposed to be this epitome of masculinity as far as like native and settler relations are concerned, is taking orders or is speaking for a woman. And there's
Well, I
this
also think
interesting
there's
kind
a
of
very like funny there's a very funny, interesting line of thought that whenever
yeah.
the British have a queen, she cannot be a woman. She exists outside of gender, you know?
Right. We talk about the crown. Right. Exactly. We
Yeah.
don't refer to the queen. We talk about the idea of the crown, which is much more powerful. Totally.
The queen is a woman, but she is also not a woman, you know?
Yeah. And, as evidenced by, at the time it would have been Victoria, but obviously any subsequent, like if you want to talk about Charles, for example, who's coronated tomorrow, like we still talk about the crown as an institution. That's it suddenly like shifts the grounds of negotiation in a sense, right? Are you dealing with an institution or are you dealing with a person? Because that suddenly changes what you're talking about, right? And I think you're right in this case. I mean, Big Bear, I think, is trying to shift that ground. He's trying to interact with a person, whereas what Morris is saying is that no, you're dealing with something much bigger than just one person, or at least he's representing something much bigger than a person, which is perhaps more terrifying and
Society.
much more. Yeah, exactly. In this case, imperialism. Right?
We live in a society.
Thanks, joke. Right.
Anyway.
But it's a really great passage in this case. Yeah. And it also kind of points one of the lines that you spoke, or at least that middle section, sorry, the queen speaks to us. Yes, you have heard her voice, whom God bless and preserve long to reign over us. But he didn't hear his voice, right? Nobody heard her voice. You heard Morris's voice speaking the queen, in this case, speaking the crown. And this really gets to the heart of like a really central concern for Wiebe in this case, in a lot of his work, both in the short story that I mentioned before, but also I think in this work and others, is that central question of where is a voice coming from, right? Who is speaking a voice? For what purpose? Why? When? Because obviously, like, there are questions of temporality that we brought up, but that also comes back to questions of voice in this case. Big Bear is speaking in the past, but also relates to things in the present. So that voice is coming from like from a historical present. The queen is speaking on a piece of paper, but through the voice of Morris. Where is that voice coming from? What does that change? And I think these are like some really interesting questions that the book raises.
Yeah, and some important questions.
I don't know. Do you have anything to say about that? Like, where is the voice coming? Why that matters?
I think it's about, because there's a lot of talk these days about separating the author from the work, death of the author, the word of God, blah, blah, blah. And I think this is a case where the who is, since it's historically based, the who of writing it is important to know and understand, you know?
Yeah. So who is the author?
Isn't it Rudy Wiebe?
Yes, but is it? He is speaking through other people's voices in this case. Like, I think what you're talking about is very much that question, right? Is Wiebe the author, right? How do you determine a historical like text in this case?
You accept it as a metatextual blend.
Exactly, right? It is metatext in this case, Totally.
You accept it the same way you do a biodoc or a biopic. Like take this is gonna be a weird comparison, but the Bohemian Rhapsody movie that came out. There's a bunch of different voices, and there's obviously dramatizations, and you have to accept that, and you have to accept the metatextual blend and the contextual blend around it, and you just have to roll with it, you know?
Yeah. And yeah, I feel like that's like, why does that appeal so much to to history writing in this case? Like, because you see that quite often. We talked about, for example, Atwood, who did that in Alias Grace. Kind of, there is that metatextual element in the case of Bohemian Rhapsody, like you were talking about. Obviously, this book. Why do you think that matters so much for like historical writing, of like asking that question of where is the voice coming from, or
Because it
metatextual
helps you to
concerns?
critically understand the work as a piece of entertainment versus a piece of like history. Like,
At the same time, it does also inform how
yeah,
history is made, though. Yeah.
oh, for sure. It's all about how we understand history and how history is formed. Like, I'm not saying biopics are not, and books like this aren't actually like good sources of history or information. They are, but I think you still have to understand that difference so that way you know what you're watching and what you're reading.
I think Wiebe in this particular book puts a lot more emphasis on the historical component of it, just because, we didn't talk
Mm-hmm.
about this really, but it starts off with a series of images and maps, right? He wants to
Yeah.
point to the fact of like, this is how we see the world, right? This is how a lot of people will see the world on a both macro, right? The maps, right? And a micro level, individual subjects, right? Big
Mm-hmm.
Bear, Morris, all these other, I think there's a picture of Poundmaker at the big, like all these people that we tend to focus on in high detail, right? With these images. Um, but ultimately what the book I think aims to deconstruct is those images, right? The actual literal idea of taking a snapshot, right, of someone in a very particular moment and only focusing
Mm-hmm.
on that particular moment, but also focusing on these people as individuals, right? And I think part of the metatextual project and this book in particular is to kind of tear those boundaries apart.
Right.
To bring it back to another example of like how that operates, by the way, if people are interested, and I know this episode is long, but I don't care. It's a really interesting topic. You might want to look at a book of poetry by Michael Ondaatje, called oh damn, I'm
Mm-hmm.
blanking on the name. It's Billy the Kid. Sorry.
Billy the Kid.
Yeah, he did a whole he did a whole thing on Billy the Kid. And in it at some point, and this I think points straight to what Wiebe is trying to do as well, but in the novel form. There's just this moment in which instead of putting a picture like there had been throughout the actual text, there's just a blank frame, right? It's just like a frame of 4 lines with nothing in it. And the whole
Mm-hmm.
point is to point to the fact that like, well, you can pretty much put whatever you want in there, right? The whole point is that we construct our own versions or our own perceptions of history based on what we know. And that's Ondaatje pointing to the fact that like you can construct a million versions of Billy the Kid in this case, right?
Yeah.
Because there are so many sources to pull from, so many perspectives, that
And
ultimately,
it
no
creates
matter
its
what
own
you,
mythology of Billy the Kid.
yeah, exactly, right. And I feel like perhaps less creatively, Weeb is doing a similar thing here, or at least less postmodern-y in a less postmodern fashion. Weeb is doing a similar thing in this case than Ondaatje is going for with that blank frame. I don't know, maybe I'm thinking about it too much, but you can tell me if I'm just like shooting out of nowhere.
No,
um,
I'm with you.
okay, okay. There's some interesting. I want to bring back the idea, and this is like the last major point that I wanted to talk about with the novel. I wanted to
Yeah,
bring
because
back the idea of the sacred bundle, right? That I brought up at the beginning as something that was an integral part of Big Bear's leadership, right? Part of his charisma seemed to be derived from the importance that he attached to this bundle, right, and the power that it gave him. And yeah, there's a few passages. There's one on page 111 that I want to point to, like the gap between 111 and 112, that I want to read in this case. Yeah, and then talk about the bundle as it's presented in the text and how we can kind of think about it as a symbol.
Mhm.
Cloud told me he has a bundle from the great parent bear. That is, he is guided in war by the most powerful spirit helper known to the Kree, and that this bundle made him, until recently, the absolute terror of all the Black. He looks innocuous enough, sporting no scalps or any kind of decoration on his scarred chest, which I must admit appears to be at least the proportions of my own. But I believe that now it is his voice and his perception which draws more and more people to him. His voice would be unbelievable in Parliament. So that specific passage I find really interesting, like associating Big Bear's charisma, and also how he tries to play the game, right, by associating it with Parliament, by the way, which we talked about. But also like associating that charisma with the bundle in this case, this kind of like spiritual and otherworldly power that is conveyed by it, or what Big Bear and his followers believe is conveyed by that bundle, right? And the spirit that's attached to it. Yeah, I feel like there's there's one of the texts that I brought up in this case in the sources, the Sherrill Grace one, Western Myth and Northern History, the Plain Indians of Berger and Wiebe, does kind of address the bundle less as something that appears throughout the novel because it doesn't really show up that much, right? But more of a symbolic representation of how the novel is structured, and I find that really interesting. And the way that Grace brings it up, right, is that in a similar way that Big Bear used that paw or that little bundle, right, that he kept around his neck. Grace makes the point that Weeb kind of ritualizes his readers to kind of approach certain ideas, right? To approach the spirituality, and through his use of particular languages, just very much talking about these much bigger ideas that are represented by ultimately this very self-contained story. And as she mentions, right, he's kind of wrapping up this very, very important historical and literary event in, right, the confines of a relatively short book, right, in the grand scheme of in which, readers, as we've been doing, are kind of meant to negotiate the meaning of it, or the meaning that we can ascribe to it outside of itself, right, much like the bundle. And kind of goes on to describe Weeb's novels, not just this one, as kind of word bundles, so to speak, which, yeah, I find kind of cool. I don't know if you have anything to say about that in particular, like this idea of the bundle being more symbolic than anything else, right? Than actually
No, I think
holding
you hit
power.
it on the head.
Okay. And just something that I want to mention, because it was brought up in the article and I found that really freaking cool. And I'm interested to hear how you going to relate this to the novel or what we've been talking about so far.
Oh, yay.
So bringing back to the image of the bundle. So apparently each time Big Bear consulted the bear paw, he would place a new piece of cloth directly around the paw itself. He would kind of unpack it and place a new piece of cloth. And so when Weeb himself, as a writer and someone who was researching the topic, went to see the Sacred Bundle, which is in a museum in New York City, or at least was at the time, I don't know today, the outside wrappings, what we saw was the oldest, right? And that was faded and worn. But as you kind of unwrap it and go through the concentric layers, like an onion, if you will, they became progressively brighter and newer looking, right? And obviously the most radiant cloths were right next to the paw itself. And I find that really cool, right? This idea of putting the newest cloth right beside the paw and it being the most radiant after all this time. And I'm curious how you would kind of think through that idea in relation to the novel, or at least Big Bear, as we were talking about.
How it goes from outside old to in.
Old is outside, new is in.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think it's a real interesting, because in the usual stories, we always have it go the other way, as if the new is growing out and overtaking.
Yeah.
But to me, this is I like that it is so different.
How does it change your reading of it, or perhaps your perception of it?
I think it shows a lot more about Big Bear, like his value of the new over, like it's the job of the old to protect the new sort of thing, while still having a symbol of the old at the heart of it.
Yeah.
It's like a donut almost, you know?
Okay. Elaborate, please.
Well, and so far that like there's because there's the bear pot at the center, and
Mm.
then you have the wraps around it, you know? So instead of it's not like a donut with a hole, it's one of those full donuts.
Yeah. The jelly donuts. Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. But it's still a donut, you know, because it has such a nice juicy center.
No, but I do like, all jokes aside, obviously, but like I do like this idea that it's kind of flipping traditional storytelling on its head, so to speak. Usually, either in research or in novels, you want to bring new things, right? Or at least you want to expose the newness of it. Like it's a
Mhm.
flashy, but I think Wiebe is making you work for the new, and so is Big Bear, so to speak. And I agree with you in this case that you have to go through the tradition in order to expose the newness of any kind of
Mhm.
society or vision of a character or a history or whatever you want, right? A novel in this case.
Right.
And I think we don't have time to get into it in that much detail, but I think the novel also parallels that in a sense, both as like the turning points happening right around the middle of the novel, um, which would be like the center, so to speak,
Mhm.
but also kind of bookending the novels with what you'd expect, so to speak. And really what's in the middle, what's within those are what's most interesting, right? And it's kind of what we've
Mhm.
talked about. Okay, so wrapping up in this case,
Yeah, because we've
for
been
this,
going for a while now.
we've been going for a while. I don't know how long we've actually been going because we did like a pre-talk, so I don't know. I think we started around 7. I don't know. Who's to say? We would go on to win the Governor General's Award for this novel, which I think is really interesting. And in
Mhm.
my mind, kind of shows like a change that was happening in Canada in the 70s.
Yeah, it's again, it's a symbolic thing for sure, but it is indicative of some growth. It isn't like we do talk about Canada still has many problems, and so does the world, but there is an indication of some sort of growth going on.
Yeah. Um, And I'm wondering, like, as a wrap up in this case, because Big Bear in himself, like we were saying, is very tangential to a lot of the events that he was kind of
Mhm.
related to, or at least some of them. He would be a vocal opponent, obviously, but sometimes he just was there. Um, and I'm wondering, like, why you think it would be important to talk about him in a novel in particular. Like, where's the interest for you, or where do you think the interest for Weeb lies in addressing this character who, by many accounts, a small part of his life was interesting and even then tangent?
Mhm.
Like, what would be the interest for you of like addressing this particular?
Of addressing the character of Big Bear, or because of his different approach, like we talked about at the beginning, really, like
Mm.
his different views, and you know, we talked about it, if his in a different world and in a different time, this is a guy who this is a person who has this ability to speak, to be heard, probably learned to play politics pretty well.
Yeah,
The phrase we used was prime minister of the First Nations people.
right. Which, you know, like I said, we were going to talk about it, and we don't necessarily, because, like you said, this episode's already a bit long, so we don't necessarily have to go in depth in it. But it is kind of interesting to think of it like that because
Hmm.
I know that like that specific use of the term prime minister of the is kind of interesting because
Hmm.
a lot of indigenous critics that you read today do point to the fact that the political system that they have is kind of broken because a lot of it was imposed by the Canadian government.
Hmm.
And it's not their traditional way of life. And so it's interesting for me that you would bring that up. And I think you're right, is that Big Bear at the same time is this person that obviously wanted to protect a traditional way of life, but did so on settler norms in this case, trying to play by their own. And it inevitably led to problems in this case. And so it's this very interesting, like, last vestige um, of traditional chiefhood that was meant to offer an alternative to violence, but that ultimately got bulldozed over.
Hmm.
And I think that's what makes for the most interesting part of the book. This brief moment of what if, right? Again, bringing back this idea of the historical present the book is talking about.
Right.
Anyway, I don't know. Anything else you want to add? I think we talked a lot in this case.
Yeah, I think we've covered all the main points. There's probably more that we could talk about, but I think we've hit on everything we need to talk about.
Always, that's always the main goal of this the episode. Go read the books we're talking about.
Yeah. Go open a fucking book. God. Stupid
Stop being
Zoomers.
lazy. Stop listening to podcasts. Go read a book.
Get a fucking TikTok.
All right. Do you want to do the outro?
All right. Okay, everyone. Thanks for listening. You can reach out with any questions, comments, or concerns on the Facebook page and by email. You can support the show through PayPal as a pay what you feel is worth, and through affiliate links in the recommended reading page we have set up. Find perks like extra and ad-free episodes on Patreon. Please keep listening to the show, telling us what you think. We have a bunch of new things coming out, like a bunch of new interviews that Patrick's been doing and organizing that are so baller. And if you leave on a review on iTunes, share with some friends, would also be greatly appreciated. Helps to boost the show and gets to most people's ears. We'll see you next time on Historia Canadiana.
Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
We get our weekly groceries delivered through Instacart because once football season starts, game time is family time. I can get everything my family needs for the week, from reliable staples to specialty ingredients, all delivered right to my door in as fast as 1 hour. So I can stay on my game without missing a minute of the game. Visit instacart.com or download the app to get free delivery on your first 3 orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Minimum order $10. Additional terms apply. Instacart. Add life to cart.